Take a calm breath. Get into a comfortable position and slowly relax. Now I'm letting you drift into the flow of the story. The ferry moved slowly across the calm sea. You stood near the railing and watched the mainland disappear behind you. The city had already become a distant line on the horizon. Soon, even that vanished. Only the sea remained. The water stretched endlessly in every direction. Seagulls followed the ferry, gliding above the waves. The salty wind carried away the sounds of your old life. For years, your days had been filled with noise. Traffic, deadlines, crowded streets, people always rushing somewhere. But today felt different. Today, you were leaving all of that behind. A month ago, you had seen an unusual job advertisement. A small island was looking for a new postman. The previous postman had retired after more than 30 years. Now someone new was needed. Someone willing to deliver letters, packages, and messages across the island. Most people would have ignored the offer. You did not. Something about the idea stayed with you. A quiet island. A bicycle. A simple routine. The chance to know every road and every face. Eventually, you applied. A week later, the job was yours. Now, as the ferry continued through the afternoon sunlight, you wondered what waited for you on the island. After another hour, you finally saw it. A small piece of land appeared in the distance. Green hills rose from the sea. White houses stood along the shoreline. A lighthouse watched over the harbor from a rocky cliff. The island looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. As the ferry approached the dock, you noticed a handful of people waiting near the harbor. Some carried fishing nets. Others sat on benches watching the boats come and go. Life moved slowly here, and nobody seemed to be in a hurry. The ferry horn sounded once. A few minutes later, the boat gently reached the dock. You picked up your suitcase and stepped onto the island. The air smelled of salt and fresh sea breeze. Somewhere nearby, waves touched the shore. For a moment, you simply stood there and looked around. This was your new home. A man wearing a navy blue jacket approached with a smile. You must be the new postman. You nodded. I am. He introduced himself as Thomas, the owner of the island's small post office. Together, you walked through the harbor. The streets were narrow. Flower boxes hung beneath windows. Small boats floated quietly in the water. Everything felt calm. Eventually, Thomas stopped in front of a simple stone building. A wooden sign above the door read, "Island Post Office." "This is yours now," he said with a smile. You looked at the building, then at the quiet street around it. And for the first time since leaving the city, you felt completely certain. You had made the right decision. As the afternoon sun slowly lowered toward the sea, a new chapter of your life quietly began. The next morning, you woke up to the sound of seagulls. For a moment, you forgot where you were. Then you heard the distant waves outside your window. The island. You smiled. The morning sunlight filled the small room above the post office. Everything felt calm. There were no car horns. No crowded streets. Only the sea and the wind. After breakfast, you walked downstairs. Thomas was already there, sorting letters behind the counter. Stacks of envelopes covered the wooden desk. Some were large. Some were small. Each one was waiting for a journey across the island. "Ready for your first route?" Thomas asked. You nodded. "I think so." He smiled. "I felt the same way on my first day." Then he handed you a folded map. Most of the island was covered with small roads and walking paths. Tiny marks showed houses scattered across the coastline and hills. "There aren't many people here," Thomas explained. "But everyone knows everyone." He pointed toward a bicycle leaning outside the post office. The frame was old but well maintained. A large leather mailbag hung from the side. "She'll take good care of you," Thomas said. You laughed. The bicycle looked as if it had already served several generations of postmen. A few minutes later, you loaded the letters into the bag and started your route. The wheels rolled smoothly over the stone streets. The harbor slowly disappeared behind you. Soon, the road followed the coastline. The sea stretched beside you, sparkling beneath the morning sun. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and wildflowers. Your first stop was a small white cottage near the shore. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A wooden fishing boat rested nearby. You placed the letter inside the mailbox. Simple. Quiet. Yet somehow satisfying. The next house stood farther up the road. Then another. And another. Each home looked different. Some had colorful gardens. Some had vegetable patches. Some overlooked the sea from high cliffs. As the morning passed, you began noticing something unusual. The letters were not just mail. They were connections. One envelope carried news from a daughter studying in another country. Another contained photographs from distant relatives. A package held knitting supplies for an elderly woman. Every delivery linked one life to another. By midday, you reached the northern side of the island. There, the road climbed gently toward a grassy hill. At the top stood a wooden bench facing the sea. You stopped for lunch. The island stretched below you. Small houses. Fishing boats. Narrow roads winding between green fields. Everything seemed peaceful from up here. You sat quietly and listened to the waves below. For the first time in years, you felt no pressure to be anywhere else. When lunch was finished, you continued your route. The afternoon passed slowly. House by house. Letter by letter. Smile by smile. By the time you returned to the post office, the sun was beginning to set. Your mailbag was empty. The streets glowed with warm evening light. Thomas looked up as you entered. "How was your first day?" You thought for a moment. Then you smiled. "It felt like I delivered more than letters." Thomas nodded, as if he already understood exactly what you meant. Outside, the sea reflected the colors of the sunset. And on the quiet island, your new life was beginning to feel a little more familiar. A few days passed on the island. Each morning, you loaded letters into your mailbag and followed the winding roads across the coastline. The routes slowly became familiar. You learned which houses had blue doors, which gardens were filled with roses, which dogs liked to run beside your bicycle for a few minutes before returning home. Life on the island moved gently, and with each passing day, you felt more at home. One morning, while sorting letters at the post office, Thomas handed you a single envelope. "This one goes to the lighthouse," he said. You looked at the address. It was written simply. The lighthouse keeper. No street name. No house number. Just the lighthouse. Thomas smiled. "Everyone knows where he lives." You placed the envelope carefully into your bag. The lighthouse stood at the far eastern edge of the island. It was the most distant stop on your route. After leaving the village behind, the road became narrower. The sea stretched endlessly beside you. White waves rolled against the rocky shore below. The wind felt stronger here. Seagulls circled high above the cliffs. For nearly an hour, you followed the coastal road. Eventually, the lighthouse appeared, tall and white, standing alone on a rocky headland. It seemed to watch over the sea just as it had for generations. As you approached, you noticed a small stone cottage beside it. A garden surrounded the building. Vegetables grew in neat rows. A few flowers added color to the landscape. Everything looked carefully maintained. You parked your bicycle near the gate. Before you could knock, the front door opened. An elderly man stepped outside. His silver hair moved gently in the wind. "You must be the new postman," he said. You smiled. "And you must be the lighthouse keeper." The man laughed softly. "I suppose I am." You handed him the envelope. He looked at it for a moment before placing it carefully into his pocket. Then he surprised you. "Would you like some tea?" You had nowhere else to be. So you accepted. A few minutes later, you were sitting beside a window overlooking the sea. The lighthouse keeper poured tea into 2 cups. The room felt warm and comfortable. Books filled the shelves. Old maps hung on the walls. Everything seemed to tell a story. How long have you lived here? You asked. The old man thought for a moment. Almost 40 years. You nearly dropped your cup. 40 years. He nodded. The island changes slowly. That's one reason I stayed. Together, you looked out at the sea. A fishing boat moved across the horizon. The lighthouse stood quietly outside, still doing its work. Day after day, year after year. The old man smiled. People think this place is lonely. He glanced toward the ocean. But I've never felt alone here. You understood what he meant, the sea, the wind, the birds, the changing seasons. Life was always moving around him, just in a quieter way. After finishing your tea, you stood to leave. The lighthouse keeper walked you to the door. Before you left, he pointed toward the horizon. Come back during autumn, he said. The storms are beautiful from here. You promised you would. Then you climbed onto your bicycle and continued your route. As the lighthouse grew smaller behind you, you thought about the people who lived on the island. Each one had their own story, their own routines, their own place in the world. And with every letter you delivered, you were slowly becoming part of those stories. A week later, you woke up to a different sound. Rain. Soft drops tapped gently against your window. The sky outside was covered with grey clouds. The sea looked darker than usual. For a moment, you remained in bed and listened. The island sounded different in the rain. Quieter. Softer. Almost sleepy. After getting dressed, you walked downstairs to the post office. Thomas was already preparing the day's mail. He looked out the window and smiled. Looks like you'll get to see the island in its rainy mood today. You glanced outside. The streets were empty. The harbor was hidden beneath a light mist. Everything seemed wrapped in silence. A few minutes later, you packed the letters into waterproof bags. Then you pulled on a raincoat and stepped outside. The cool air greeted you immediately. Rain fell steadily but gently. There was no wind. Only the constant sound of water. You climbed onto your bicycle and began your route. The tires rolled across wet stone roads. Small puddles reflected the cloudy sky. Flower petals rested on the sidewalks. The village felt completely transformed. Yet somehow, it was just as beautiful. Your first few deliveries were quiet. Most people stayed indoors. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Warm yellow lights glowed behind windows. As you rode through the village, you caught small glimpses of island life. A woman reading beside a fireplace. A family sharing breakfast. An old man watching the rain from his porch. The rain seemed to slow everything down. And nobody appeared to mind. Farther along the coast, the road curved beside the sea. Normally, you could hear seagulls. Today, all you heard was rain meeting water. The ocean stretched into the grey horizon. Calm and endless. You found yourself slowing your bicycle. Not because you were tired, but because there was no reason to rush. The island taught that lesson every day. Near midday, you arrived at a small cottage you had never visited before. It stood alone near the cliffs. A narrow path led to the front door. You placed a letter into the mailbox. Then, just as you were turning away, the door opened. A small elderly woman stepped outside. She held an umbrella covered with tiny blue flowers. "Good morning," she called. "Good morning," you replied. She smiled. "You must be the new postman." It seemed everyone on the island already knew. The woman glanced at the letter in her hand. "I've been waiting for this." You nodded politely. Then she surprised you. "Would you like a homemade cookie for the road?" A few moments later, she handed you a small paper bag. The smell of fresh cinnamon filled the air. You thanked her. As you continued riding, the warm cookie rested safely inside your pocket. For some reason, it made the rainy day feel even warmer. The afternoon passed slowly. Rain continued falling across the island. The fields turned bright green. The flowers seemed happier than ever. By the time you finished your route, the clouds were beginning to break apart. Small patches of blue sky appeared above the sea. Sunlight touched the water once again. As you rode back toward the village, tiny drops still clung to the leaves and fences. Everything sparkled. The island looked freshly washed. New. Peaceful. Back at the post office, Thomas looked up from his desk. How was your first rainy route? You smiled. Different. He nodded. Most good things are. That evening, as rainwater slowly dripped from the rooftops, you sat by your window and watched the sea. The island had many faces. Sunny mornings. Golden sunsets. Stormy horizons. And now, gentle rainy days. You were beginning to love every one of them. The rain had passed. The island was bright again. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Fishing boats moved peacefully across the harbor. Life returned to its usual rhythm. One morning, while helping Thomas sort the mail, you noticed something unusual. A single envelope sat apart from the others. There was no address. No street name. No house number. Only 2 words were written on the front. For Elias. You picked it up. Who's Elias? You asked. Thomas glanced at the envelope. Then he smiled. That's a good question. You looked at him. You don't know? Oh, I know several Eliases. He leaned back in his chair. The problem is that there are 3 of them on the island. You laughed. That's not very helpful. No, Thomas agreed. It isn't. For a moment, both of you stared at the envelope. Then Thomas shrugged. Looks like you'll have to solve the mystery. So you added the letter to your mailbag. Your route suddenly felt a little more interesting. The first Elias lived near the harbor. He was a fisherman with weathered hands and a small blue boat. When you handed him the envelope, he immediately shook his head. Not mine. He looked at the handwriting. I think I know who wrote this. You waited, then he smiled. But I could be wrong. That was not particularly helpful either. The second Elias lived farther inland. He owned a small orchard filled with apple trees. When he saw the letter, he laughed. I haven't received a letter in years. He examined the envelope carefully. Then he handed it back. Not for me. You sighed dramatically. The mystery continued. The third Elias lived on the northern side of the island. His cottage stood near a field of tall grass overlooking the sea. By the time you arrived, the afternoon sun was shining brightly. You knocked on the door. A man in his 70s opened it. When you showed him the envelope, he became very quiet. For a few seconds, he simply stared at the handwriting. Then he smiled. A small, surprised smile. I wondered if I would ever see this again. You immediately knew the letter belonged to him. He thanked you and carefully held the envelope. Not opening it. Just holding it. As if it were something fragile. You were curious. But island life had already taught you something important. Not every story belonged to the person delivering the letter. Some stories belonged to the people receiving them. So you simply wished him a good afternoon and returned to your bicycle. As you started riding away, the man called after you. You turned around. He lifted the unopened envelope slightly. It came from an old friend. You smiled. I'm glad it found you. So am I, he replied. The road home followed the coastline. The sea sparkled beneath the afternoon light. A gentle breeze moved through the grass. As you rode, you thought about the journey of that single letter. Across the sea. Across time. Across years of silence. All the way to the right person. And somehow, on a small island surrounded by water, it had found its way home. By the time you returned to the post office, Thomas was waiting. Well, he asked. "Did you find the right Elias?" You nodded. Thomas smiled. "I had a feeling you would." Outside, the evening sun began to sink toward the horizon. And somewhere on the island, an old friend's words were finally being read after a very long journey. By now, several weeks had passed since your arrival on the island. The roads felt familiar. The faces felt familiar. Even the sound of the waves had become part of your daily routine. Every morning, you packed your mailbag. Every morning, you climbed onto your bicycle. And every morning, the island welcomed you in its own quiet way. One sunny afternoon, Thomas handed you a small stack of letters. Most of them were routine deliveries. But one address caught your attention. A small cottage near the western shore. The name written on the envelope was Mrs. Eleanor Reed. Thomas noticed you reading it. "Ah," he said with a smile. "Eleanor. You know her. Everyone does." That seemed to be a common answer on the island. Thomas chuckled. "She has lived here longer than almost anyone." You placed the letter into your bag and began your route. The western shore was one of the quieter parts of the island. Few people lived there. The road followed the coastline for miles. Wild grass danced in the breeze. The sea stretched endlessly beside you. Eventually, you spotted the cottage. It stood alone on a small rise overlooking the water. White walls. Blue shutters. A garden full of lavender. The scent reached you before you even arrived. You parked your bicycle and walked toward the mailbox. Before you could place the letter inside, the front door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head. She smiled immediately. "You must be the new postman." You laughed. "Does everyone already know me?" "Of course." Her eyes sparkled. "This is a small island." You handed her the letter. She accepted it carefully. For a moment, she simply looked at the envelope. Then she smiled again. "My grandson." You nodded politely. "He writes every month." There was pride in her voice. And affection, the kind that only family could bring. Then she surprised you. "Would you like to sit for a few minutes?" You glanced at the road. Your route was nearly finished. There was no reason to rush. So you accepted. A short time later, you were sitting in her garden overlooking the sea. Lavender swayed gently around you. The afternoon sun warmed the stone path. Eleanor poured tea into 2 small cups. "This garden belonged to my husband," she said. You looked around. Every flower seemed carefully cared for. He loved this place. She smiled toward the sea. He used to sit right there every evening. She pointed toward an old wooden chair near the edge of the garden. For a moment, neither of you spoke. The waves rolled quietly onto the shore below. Then Eleanor looked at you. "The peace." She smiled. "Partly." Then she looked toward the horizon. "We stay because eventually every face becomes familiar." You listened. "The baker knows your favorite bread. The fisherman waves every morning. The postman learns where everyone lives." She laughed softly. "And before you realize it, you're part of the island too." Those words stayed with you. Because deep down, you knew she was right. The island no longer felt like a place you had moved to. It was beginning to feel like home. When it was time to leave, Eleanor walked with you to the gate. Before you climbed onto your bicycle, she handed you a small bundle of lavender. "For your room." The scent was fresh and calming. You thanked her. Then you continued down the coastal road. As the cottage slowly disappeared behind you, the lavender rested safely inside your mailbag. And somehow, the island felt even warmer than it had that morning. Not because the weather had changed, but because another stranger had become a friend. Summer had fully arrived on the island. The mornings were brighter. The sea shimmered beneath clear blue skies. Windows stood open. Gardens overflowed with flowers. Even the harbor seemed more lively than before. One morning, while organizing the day's deliveries, Thomas placed a medium-sized package on the counter. "This one is important," he said. You examined the label. It was addressed to the island bakery. You already knew the place. Everyone on the island did. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the village streets. Sometimes you could smell it before you even saw the building. You carefully placed the package into your mailbag. A short while later, you set off on your route. The bakery was near the center of the village, not far from the harbor. As you approached, the familiar scent of warm bread filled the air. Fresh loaves, sweet pastries, a hint of cinnamon. The smell alone could make someone hungry. The bakery itself was small and welcoming. Flower boxes sat beneath the windows. A wooden sign swayed gently above the entrance. You parked your bicycle and picked up the package. The bell above the door rang softly as you stepped inside. The warmth greeted you immediately. Behind the counter stood a woman covered lightly in flour. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Postman." You laughed. At this point, everyone seemed to know your name or at least your job. "Package delivery," you said. Her eyes brightened. Finally, she hurried forward and accepted the box. "You've been waiting for it?" you asked. "Oh yes." She turned the package over carefully. "The new baking molds." You nodded, though you weren't entirely sure what baking molds were. She seemed delighted, however. And that was enough. Before you could leave, she pointed toward a small table near the window. "Sit for a minute." You hesitated. Then the smell of freshly baked pastries convinced you. A few moments later, you were sitting by the window with a warm pastry and a cup of tea. The baker introduced herself as Clara. Between customers, she told you stories about the bakery. Her grandparents had opened it many decades ago. Her parents had continued running it. Now it belonged to her. "The recipes haven't changed much," she said. "Neither has the building." You looked around. The wooden shelves. The old photographs. The worn stone floor. The bakery felt like part of the island itself, as if it had always been there. A customer entered. Then another. And another. Each person greeted Clara by name. Each conversation felt natural and familiar. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody seemed distracted. The bakery wasn't just a business. It was a meeting place. A small part of daily life. As you finished your tea, Clara wrapped a small paper package and handed it to you. "What's this?" you asked. "Tomorrow's breakfast." You laughed. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She smiled. "But I want to." You thanked her and stood. Outside, the village was glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Children played near the harbor. Fishing boats rocked gently in the water. The sea sparkled beyond them. You placed Clara's gift safely into your mailbag and climbed back onto your bicycle. As you continued your route, you thought about how every place on the island seemed connected. The lighthouse keeper, Eleanor, Thomas, Clara. Each person added something to the island. And together, they created something larger than themselves. Not just a village. Not just an island. A community. And little by little, you were finding your place within it. By the end of summer, your days on the island followed a familiar rhythm. You woke with the seagulls. You sorted letters with Thomas. You rode your bicycle along the winding roads. You greeted familiar faces. And every evening, the sea welcomed the setting sun. The island no longer felt new. It felt known. Comfortable. Like a favorite book you could open to any page. One afternoon, after finishing most of your deliveries, you noticed there was only one letter left in your mailbag. Just one. The address belonged to a small cottage on the southern coast. A place you had visited several times before. The road there was quiet and beautiful. So instead of rushing, you slowed your pace. The afternoon was warm. Golden sunlight covered the fields. The sea sparkled beyond the cliffs. The island seemed completely at peace. As you rode, you realized something. When you had first arrived, every road felt unfamiliar. Every house felt like a mystery. Every face was new. Now things were different. You knew where the lavender cottage stood. You knew when Clara's bakery opened each morning. You knew which fishermen always waved from the harbor. You even knew which dogs would run beside your bicycle. The island had become part of your daily life, and you had become part of the island. Eventually, you reached the final cottage, a small white house overlooking the sea. You delivered the letter and exchanged a few friendly words with the owner. Then your work was done. For the first time that day, you had nowhere to be. No route to follow. No deliveries waiting. Only the evening ahead. Instead of returning immediately, you followed a narrow path leading toward a grassy hill near the coast. You had noticed the hill many times before, but today felt like the right day to climb it. At the top stood a single wooden bench, the same one you had seen during your first week on the island. You sat down. The view stretched endlessly before you. The sea, the harbor, the lighthouse in the distance, the village nestled between green hills. Everything you had come to know. The sun slowly lowered toward the horizon. The sky turned gold, then orange, then shades of pink and purple. The water reflected every color. For a long time, you simply sat and watched. No music, no conversation, only the sound of waves far below. As the last light touched the sea, you thought about everything that had happened since your arrival. The ferry ride, your first route, the lighthouse keeper, the rainy morning, the mysterious letter, Eleanor's garden, Clara's bakery, all the small moments that had quietly shaped your new life. None of them had seemed important at the time, yet together, they had changed something inside you. The island had taught you patience. It had taught you to notice small things, to appreciate simple routines, to enjoy moments that would once have passed unnoticed. The final edge of the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. Evening settled gently across the island. Lights began to appear in distant windows, tiny points of warmth scattered across the landscape. You smiled. Because for the first time, those lights did not belong to strangers. They belonged to neighbors, to friends, to people whose stories you now knew. And as the stars slowly appeared above the sea, you realized something simple. You had come to the island looking for a new job, but somewhere along the way, you had found a home.